welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Happy to have you with us once again. If you missed our first episode this week, we got together on Monday. It was Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen, and myself breaking down our top takeaways from a 49-10 victory last Saturday for Penn State at Purdue. The Nittany Lions remain at number 4 in the college football playoff rankings. If you shut down the college football season now and thrust us right into playoff action, Penn State will be set up for a home matchup in Beaver Stadium against the Georgia Bulldogs, a team that recently won back-to-back national championships. Will be quite the matchup, but it's not over yet. We've got 2 more Penn State matchups to look forward to. Next week, they'll finish out the regular season at home against Maryland. Of course, this Saturday, traveling to Minneapolis for the first time since 2019 when they lost as an unbeaten team. They will take on the Golden Gophers. You will hear a lot about those Golden Gophers on this episode of the podcast. A little bit later, we'll bring on Ryan Burns, who is a longtime Minnesota insider with our 24/7 Sports Network. He'll give us the highs and lows of a 6-4 season so far for Minnesota, spotlight the players that we need to be aware of heading into this matchup, and ultimately he'll share his thoughts on what he expects from this Minnesota and Penn State game. We'll do that, of course, on our Thursday episode when Mark and Daniel come back on board. We'll let you know what we heard and what we saw from the practice field on Wednesday. But we begin this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast with a recruiting conversation. That means we're bringing back on board Tyler Calvaruso, a resident recruiting insider at the site. Tyler, welcome back in.
Good to be back, man. It's we're getting closer. December 4th is almost here. So it's been a fun cycle.
December 4th, for those who are not in the know, is the beginning of the early signing period in December. We had become accustomed in recent cycles to that being closer to Christmas, later in the month. But it's, I guess, one less thing that we need to worry about come Christmas week. We might have a playoff game to consider. We might have transfer portal movement to consider. But the signing period will be wrapped up earlier, which means right now, the last 10, 11 days of November, pretty important stuff for Penn State as they try to put the finishing touches on their 2025 class. And we're going to focus a lot on flip targets here, Tyler. That's kind of been the theme, I feel like, when we've talked about this 2025 class since the fall really started. They've got a couple of them on board. Matthew Outen, who's a top 24/7 wide receiver, flipped from Virginia Tech. We also saw Cam Smith, top 24/7 linebacker, flip from Duke during this cycle. Let's talk about the latest. It's going to be a flip somewhere, but it's kind of going to be an exploration process in between point A and point B for Zahir Mathis, top 24/7 edge rusher out of Philadelphia, had been committed to Ohio State since last winter, but didn't prevent him from exploring other options. He made a couple trips to Penn State in the summer, including an official visit and including the Lash Bash event. And now here he is, a few weeks before the early signing period, reopening his recruitment. That came through on Monday. Brian Doan, national recruiting analyst at 24/7 Sports, had some analysis on Lions247.com about what's next for Mathis. So what do you make of this step for Zahir Mathis, who, let's face it, his stock has gone down a bit as a recruit. I think early on in his high school career, many were circling him as the premier player in the state of Pennsylvania for the 2025 class. He doesn't hold that ranking right now. He's dropped a bit in our top 24/7. But still a guy that when teams look forward toward the future and think about what he could be at 20, 21 years old, there's going to be a lot of energy and a lot of interest around this young man for the next couple of weeks and potentially beyond, because he cannot graduate early. So we're not looking at a January enrollment from what I understand.
No, we're not. So that would give Mathis the potential to take things beyond that early signing period, go all the way to February if he wants to do. And I mean, there's no rush really at this point. Mathis is a guy who he's raw, but there are programs that like his upside. And that's why you're seeing kind of this flux of schools reaching out to him since he went public with his decision in the open market, back off that Ohio State commitment. It's funny, we thought that Mathis getting back to Columbus for his official with the Buckeyes could really lock things down in that regard. It wound up going the other way, where Mathis is now exploring his options, Penn State being one of them. Deion Barnes did reach out after Mathis announced his decommitment. And I'm not quite sure how crazy Penn State is going to go to get Mathis on board. They have a pretty solid class right now on the edge, with Chaz Coleman being that most recent addition. They really, really love Coleman's upside. They're excited about that get. You've got Deshaun Burnett, the Amani Christian standout, who they like his upside coming off the edge. And even Yvonne Camacho, who, we've pinpointed as an interior guy at the next level, there's a chance he starts out as an edge. Because if you look at where he's at physically in terms of weight, he's going to have to pack on some pounds to play on the inside at the next level. When he arrives in State College, obviously they're going to get to work with him in the weight room. But if his body's dictating defensive end edge rusher right off the bat, I think Penn State could give him a first look there. That's something that's come up in conversation. So we'll see where things go with Mathis from this point on. There has been not initial contact, but kind of initial contact in this second wave of Mathis's recruitment between Penn State and his camp. So we'll see where things go. But again, I don't necessarily get the sense Penn State's going to go overboard or go crazy to get him here. But at the end of the day, he's an in-state guy. Again, he has tools. His senior year film is I was checking it out the other day. It has its hits and its misses. I think that has to go in with he's just got to develop in certain areas. But he's got a long list of programs that have reached out since he backed off Ohio State. It's kind of really spans all of the Power Four conferences, I believe. Miami reached out, Florida State reached out, some Big Ten programs reached out. One of the top, you just mentioned it, Georgia, they're one of the teams that reached out. So we'll see where things go. But again, Penn State's involvement, it's noteworthy, but I'm not quite sure it gets beyond this conversation that we're having here today.
Okay. And Mathis, number 16 edge rusher in the nation per 24/7 Sports rankings, number 4 player in Pennsylvania, number 156 overall. It was gaudier for him in those rankings early on in the process, earlier in high school, but not too shabby as he's securely inside the top 24/7 at this moment as his senior year comes to a close at Imhotep Institute in Philadelphia. Penn State currently has 3 players from Imhotep on the roster. Kenny Wosley at cornerback, Tyseer Denmark at wide receiver. Those 2 are freshmen. And then redshirt sophomore linebacker Keon Wiley. So in terms of a heat check, it seems like maybe things aren't boiling with Zahir Mathis and Penn State. But I think it's very much clear that Penn State is really heated up for Andrew Olish. And they've made that clear with their actions on the recruiting trail. He's been committed to Michigan for a while, but they've continued to treat him as an in-state priority. He's one of the premier tight ends in the country, one of the premier players, period, in Pennsylvania, top 50 overall recruit in the country. And we made mention of this on our Monday podcast when Mark and Daniel and I came off of the press conference with James Franklin at Beaver Stadium and said, it was a not so subtle reference speaking directly to Olish when he was asked about Ty Howell's job in the tight end room. He very tactfully switch that into hey, why wouldn't you want to join this room if you're an in-state tight end? And it was very much something that you gravitated towards and wrote about. And so tell us why that is noteworthy to you and where things stand with Andrew Olish here entering late November.
Well, clearly James Franklin likes doing this kind of thing. It's the second time this year he's done it. He did it earlier in the year with the Central Catholic guys and Bradley Gompers, not mentioning by name, of course, but making a pretty pointed pitch towards a prospect Penn State really wants to flip. And it's hard to argue against Franklin's logic in this regard either. Notre Dame and Oregon and Michigan too, of course, they have plenty to sell with Olish at the tight end position, but the fact of the matter is there are just very few programs in college football right now that could sell a specific position group the way Penn State can sell tight end. Tyler Warren's doing what he's doing. I mean, the proof is in the pudding there with his production. You're even seeing Luke Reynolds. He just caught his first touchdown pass of his career, former 5-star prospect. And it goes beyond this current group as well. Penn State's the track record of developing tight ends, getting them drafted, getting them to the next level, and seeing them succeed at the next level. It's very much there under Franklin's reign as head coach. So Penn State this has all been made clear to Olish behind closed doors as well. This has been a big part of the pitch. You can come here and be utilized in a manner that, you're not going to get in another program, and Penn State's going to continue to push that really hard. There's been contact since he wrapped up that Notre Dame visit, and they're going to continue to push. Oregon remains the one I'm watching really closely right now. I think Oregon's done a good job with Olish, but Penn State's going to continue to make that move, and they're going to continue fighting all the way up until the early signing period. So for Franklin to get up there, do what he did, it definitely resonates, I think, with Penn State fans because they want to see this one done. And, he's going to do whatever he has to do to get it done. He's been all in on getting Olish on board. And it's a pitch that goes beyond just Olish as well, too. Penn State's involved with a lot of high-end 26 tight ends. And applies to those guys as well because they're paying attention to what's going on right now.
Here's the quote from Franklin. I dug it up so I could read it and make sure we got this one across. He said, quote, "If you're a great tight end, specifically in the state of Pennsylvania, I don't know how you couldn't come to Penn State. There's just too much history, there's too much data, and there's too many things saying you don't need to go anywhere else. You can stay home and get everything you want in terms of your college career and also setting yourself up for the future." And obviously, Tyler Warren's going to get a chance to keep this position group in the spotlight well beyond the season. We expect him to be a round one prospect type conversation as the NFL draft nears. That's going to be good for your brand. And the fact that Tyler Warren's leaving, he's a guy who's playing, 80+% of your offensive snaps through 10 games. That's a big opportunity there for the rest of those young tight ends. I know Olish has made early opportunities a priority for him. And even though you've got arguably the top tight end on campus right now in the entire country in Tyler Warren, you're still getting Luke Reynolds involved on a week-to-week basis. He's entered all 10 games. He has played more than any tight end since freshman tight end since 2018 when it was Pat Fryermuth stepping up as a starter. So even with Tyler Warren here as the key component of your offense, I mean, you can still see Andrew Olish, looking on the outside, looking from the outside in, he can still see a freshman out there involved on a consistent basis, getting better and improving, and actually, getting to some rewards of that and getting to the end zone. Let me ask you this, without saying it's Penn State, but would you go Michigan versus the field? Where are you leaning right now? Is it going to be the flip contenders or Michigan ending up with this young man by the time that December 15th rolls around or December 10th rolls around?
I think I give the field the edge right now. I think there's more buzz surrounding the field. I mean, Michigan's fighting as hard as it can to keep Olish on board, but he's been looking around. He hasn't turned schools away, going back for a while now. Made it to Penn State, got to Oregon for an official. He's going to be back, or not Oregon, for Notre Dame for an official, excuse me. He's going to be back at Oregon for another visit. So I do give the field the edge right now.
Okay, Michigan's fighting some battles on the recruiting trail right now. They've been fighting some battles on the field. Hasn't been a pretty 2024 for the defending national champions. Let's look at a couple more flip targets over on defense that are more established and more long-term than Zahir Mathis, who, again, not a flip target, but a guy who's now on the market. These two have been off the market, but Penn State has been paying close attention. Brandon Finney committed to Oregon out of the McDonough School in Maryland. That's been a pipeline-type program for Penn State over the years for recruiting. He's a 5-star cornerback. And then top 24/7 linebacker Bradley Gompers from here in the state of Pennsylvania. He has been committed to Manny Diaz and the Duke Blue Devils for a while. Didn't stop him from getting to campus this season. So when it comes to Finney and Gompers, is Penn State making the necessary strides right now with limited time, or are you starting to see the clock run out and maybe not enough of a dent being made?
I still feel good about where things are at with Finney and Penn State. Right now with Finney, really, it's a matter of, I think, whether he's going to make that Michigan visit this weekend because his season has come to an end, so his focus is back on recruiting. As far as I know, that Michigan visit is still on the schedule. That could change, but Penn State has positioned itself quite nicely to make a move on the 5-star prospect here down the stretch. The relationships are in a really good place there. Finney has really, really just bonded well with Terry Smith throughout this process, and he's high on what Penn State could do for him at the next level. So I think as things are trending right now, I like the Nittany Lions. If he is going to make a move, I think they're in the best spot to get him off that Oregon commitment. Could come all the way down to December 4th, first day of that sign period. But again, we'll see if he makes it to Michigan for that visit this weekend. Wolverines have been chipping away at that one, but I really like where Penn State's at there. With Gompers, it's a little bit more dicey, I would say. He hasn't been back to campus since that UCLA game. Central Catholic's in the midst of a deep state playoff run. And, I think there's an aspect of academics being important here. That's why he's still locked in with Duke. There's a sense of loyalty. That's why he's still locked in with Duke. I know when he made it out to Michigan, they made a good impression on him as well. And, Penn State's been right in the thick of this since jumping in with that offer. But, Duke is fighting really, really hard to keep Gompers on board. And I do think they have a chance to do that. Manny Diaz and that staff took a chance on him before a lot of other programs, a lot of other these programs that have gotten involved since the beginning of Gomper's senior season when he put together that just dominant tape first few games for Central Catholic. So, you know, if Penn State could get him back to campus at some point before the early signing period, that would be big. I'm not quite sure when that could happen, you know, with Central Catholic making that run. Gompers has a lot on his slate right now, and he's still, as of right now, he's still on board with Duke, and Manny Diaz and company down there have given themselves a real chance to have this one stick.
Here are the top 5 players in Pennsylvania per 24/7 Sports, just a couple weeks away from this signing period for the 2025 class. Number 1 is Andrew Olish. We just discussed him, committed to Michigan. Tyler likes his odds to end up elsewhere. Penn State's certainly in that mix for the tight end. Number 2 is quarterback Matt Zollers. He's been committed to Missouri for quite some time. He did visit Penn State for the Ohio State matchup. He told our Brian Doan afterwards that he is still feeling very comfortable with his commitment to Missouri. Number 3 on that list is Bradley Gompers, who you just addressed. Duke commit. Could that change? It's a battle that Penn State continues to fight. Number 4, Zahir Mathis. All of a sudden, he's back available again. And number 5, Cam Smith, who Penn State already flipped from Duke. So interesting to kind of review where the top 5 is right now. It's not all that settled right now in the state of Pennsylvania. There are some moving pieces. Penn State's involved with a few of these guys. And so we'll see how things shape up. I know for much of this cycle, there was some consternation about where Penn State was with a lot of the in-state prospects. We'll see if they can maybe clean up a little bit here in the next couple of weeks or put a punctuation mark on this that makes the whole cycle look a little bit different than maybe how we projected back in the summer. Tyler, before we focus on a few more in-state standouts, I wanted to get to another tight end because Kendra Harrison, the number 1 overall tight end recruit in the 2026 class, a verified 5-star recruit who has everybody in the country chasing after him for quite some time now. He is set to announce on November 30th. He's going to close out this month with a commitment. Again, he's 2026, so he's not on a tight timeline here. But this announcement for his announcement comes relatively close to when he just spent time in Happy Valley. So what kind of an impression have Penn State made on Kendra Harrison during his recruitment process? And is this announcement that Penn State fans need to be paying attention to on November 30th, or is this more likely to be a hat on the table type scenario?
I think Penn State's done a nice job making a good impression on Harrison. You know, he was back for the whiteout. He called an unbelievable experience in an interview with 24/7 Dana Adams. And, you know, it wasn't his first whiteout visit. He attended last year's whiteout against Iowa as well. That went over really well with him. And he's been in contact with Ty Howell really throughout his process. Penn State has pushed hard, taking a big swing at Harrison. But, well, the intel right now is I don't think it's going to be Penn State. I think it's going to go elsewhere. There's a crystal ball pick in for Oregon. Ducks are generating a lot of buzz. So I think this one's going to go in a different direction, which isn't the end of the world for Penn State because that 2026 tight end recruiting, it's in a good spot. Penn State's in a good spot with guys like Ian Primer, J.C. Anderson, Evan Jacobson, Max Suter. So there's still a lot in the cupboard there for Ty Howell to work with. But, you know, Harrison, the timing looks good because Penn State got the most recent visit leading up to his commitment date of November 30th. But it looks like this one's going to go in a different direction.
Harrison, 6'7", 240 plus pounds out of Reidsville, North Carolina. And Oregon really showing that national ability right now, especially now they've jumped into the Big Ten to go out and recruit guys. Brandon Finney, a 5-star from Maryland. I know Tyler said Penn State could end up with him when it's all said and done. But if they're to go and get the top tight end in the country from North Carolina, it shows what the Ducks have been able to accomplish and what they're working with in terms of a sales pitch on the recruiting trail at the moment. I promised some in-state standouts. Let's get to them. You went on the road to a Harrisburg High School playoff matchup last weekend, and that's a team that's perennially competing to get in state championship games. And it's a team that we are particularly paying close attention to these days because there's a couple commits on that roster. There's another target on that roster. Let's start with one of the commits, Messiah Mickens, running back in the 2026 cycle, one of the earlier commits for that class with Penn State, jumped on board after his, or I should say before his sophomore season. We're well into the recruitment process with him. How is he feeling about the Nittany Lions? He's obviously experienced an offensive coordinator change during his recruitment. And how is he ultimately performing on the field since you got a chance to see that?
He feels really good about Penn State right now. He likes the direction of Penn State's offense under Eddie Kotelnicki. He's been really impressed with what he's put out there on the field throughout this season, and he's been around in person to see that multiple times. And the relationships are in a good place. When I talked with Mickens after the game on Friday night, and he was just effusive in his praise for Jaywan Sider and his role in his recruitment and how he thinks he could develop him. So it's good for Penn State. You know, Mickens popped up at South Carolina for a visit the next day, but he told me really he was just taking a trip with Lex Cyrus, who's his close friend, the 4-star wideout who's committed to the Gamecocks. Those two are close. He just wanted to take a trip. And I've asked around a bunch on this. There's not really a level of concern with that. So Mickens moving forward, he's trying to end this season with the state title. He's come on really strong for Harrisburg throughout the year, making the jump up in competition from Trinity High in Camp Hill, going from 2A to 6A. It was a jump, and he's adjusted quite nicely throughout the year. He had 3 touchdowns against Manheim Township. Harrisburg featured him prominently. And, he showed all of the traits that make him top 24/7 recruit. He's got good vision, hits holes hard. He's physical. He has good balance, runs through tacklers. So a lot to like there with Messiah Mickens. He's not the fastest back out there, but he has a lot going for him as a prospect. He's definitely balanced, and it was a strong showing from him. He definitely did not disappoint what I was expecting. Maybe not necessarily expecting 3 touchdowns out of him, but I was expecting a strong show, and I got to see one.
I know when we were texting on Friday night, when you were there on the sideline, you had mentioned his vision really stood out. Yeah. And that's something that is pretty innate for a running back recruit. Sometimes you can have all the athleticism in the world, but you can't quite anticipate it on the field while the play is in motion. It seems like he has that angle as a running back already. He's the number 11 running back in 24/7 sports rankings for the 2026 cycle. He's been committed to Penn State for 15 months. And because you mentioned him, and because we've been talking flips, you said he took a trip with his friend Lex Cyrus down to South Carolina. Doesn't sound like there's concern from Penn State's end or your end, but just because you mentioned him, and we didn't during the flip conversation, Lex Cyrus, 4-star receiver from the state of Pennsylvania, committed to South Carolina since preseason. Has that ship kind of sailed? Has there been a parting of ways between him and Penn State at this point? Are we waiting for any possible U-turn from either party, or can we pretty much move on from that?
I think it's kind of whatever happens. At this point, we've seen Penn State involved with other wideouts. Quincy Porter, they're pushing hard to get that one done. They got Romero Eisen back to campus. Lex Cyrus was on campus for the UCLA game. So from everything I've gathered, he's pretty solid with South Carolina. He was just back down there for the second time, and it was, I believe, this month. Actually, I'm not sure if that first visit came late October, but no, I believe it was early November. He's been down there a bunch recently. So everything I've heard is that he's ready to go with South Carolina for his future home, but we'll see. Like I said, it's kind of at the point where whatever goes down. Penn State they're working other angles, and
another receiver to get to, Tyler, is Elias Koch from that Harrisburg squad that you covered last Friday. He is the number 66 overall wide receiver in the 2026 class right now, a guy that has certainly showcased some positional versatility, a playmaker in all 3 phases for Harrisburg going back to his freshman year. That has continued now as a junior. Big frame, intriguing player who just gets the job done. We've been eyeing him up, maybe as joining this Penn State class for a little while now, it feels like, in the 2026 cycle. He's been to campus a couple times. He has teammates in that high school team, on his high school team. So are you still sensing that there is momentum between Koch and Penn State?
Definitely at this point, asking around, talking to him, I think Penn State has done a bunch to stand out here. And, he told me that he could make a decision in the summer. There are people who wouldn't be surprised if he goes before that. I think Penn State's done a really good job on a couple different fronts with Koch. First of which being Mickens and Kevin Brown have done a lot of pushing to get him into this class. They want him to be part of this group in State College, and that's something that they've made quite clear to Koch since they've been committed to Penn State. And Koch was telling me that his interest in Penn State really ratcheted up seeing the offensive Andy Kotelnicki's rolling out there this fall. So he's pretty intrigued by the direction of the wide receiver utilization in Penn State's offense. Koch was on campus at Pittsburgh for a visit coming off Friday night's game, and he got to see a pretty good game, but I think Penn State's pacing this one right now.
Tyler, the last name we wanted to get to from your trip to Harrisburg is another Nittany Lions commit, and he's a big-time prospect in the 2026 cycle. That is Kevin Brown, and just so happens that he missed a huge chunk of his junior season, unfortunately. A lot of expectations were there for him. He had a strong camp circuit. He's a 2-year starter as an underclassman for Harrisburg. I think he went from about 220 pounds to where he is now at 250, 260, maybe more than that. You spent some time with Kevin Brown. where's the health right now? And, kind of where is he in finishing out this junior campaign that was largely lost because of an injury to his foot?
Yeah, first game back, he was feeling a little bit of soreness, but nothing he wasn't anticipating. He hasn't been in action since August, so he had to work some things out early. But for my money, he was the best player on the field Friday night, which says a lot given the fact he didn't look like a guy who has been out for the majority of the year. I could tell you that much. There was a holding call early, so a guy got outside of him, which rarely happens, and he had some rust to shake off. But from that point on, really, he was his usual dominant self, and it was big for Harrisburg. Messiah Mickens even told me when Kevin Brown's out there, it's just a different kind of vibe on the offense. He brings energy, and obviously he brings some really dominant blocking from his tackle position. And you see Harrisburg takes advantage of Brown's athleticism. They line him up in the backfield in some sets. So Andy Kolnicki's probably seeing that in Salve, another athletic offensive lineman he can make use with his creativity. But, yeah, Brown's feeling good moving forward, just like Mickens and just like Hope. They want to end their junior year with the state title, and they're inching a little bit closer to reaching that goal. They're closing in. Friday night they're going to be back in action against Wilson in a district final game, and they're looking to advance in the playoffs, keep things going. Brown's going to be a pivotal part of that. He's feeling good, and if you're a Penn State fan, you got to be really happy hearing that because it was a significant foot injury. It cost him a lot of time, but he's back to full health now. He attacked the rehab process the way it needed to be attacked, and he's back where he needs to be.
Well, we appreciated all the coverage from Harrisburg. There, you got a bunch of content over at Lions247.com. Kevin Brown, Messiah Mickens, and potentially Elias Koch are three names we're going to get to know a lot in the coming years, and good foundation for that right now. Tyler, next time we have you on, we'll be gearing up for the final home game on Penn State's regular season schedule. I want to note that because they could have another home game down the road in December. You and I will talk about who is expected to be in town for that Maryland matchup as they finish out the regular season in Beaver Stadium, and we'll break down whatever recruiting nuggets pop up between now and then. Of course, along the way, over at Lions247.com, 30% off our VIP access allows you to see whatever Tyler's posting about recruiting, whatever Brian Doan is posting about recruiting, and there have been a lot of interesting notes on the flip front in recent weeks. So stay engaged. You got a couple weeks left. Exactly 2 weeks from today is when the early signing period starts, and we'll start to really turn our attention toward that next week as well, Tyler, with some key topics on this 2025 class. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thanks, man.
As promised, this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast continues with focus on the Nittany Lions' next opponent. It's their final road game of this 2024 regular season. It takes them to Minneapolis. Last time they took this trip, didn't end so well. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the week. But 2019, Penn State 9-0, Minnesota was 9-0. Penn State took the loss that day, ended up helping contribute toward them staying out of the college football playoff. Yet again, it was a magical season for Minnesota. Their head coach remains the same in PJ Fleck. They are 6-4 on the season so far. And as we've done in the past, we reached out to him before that 2019 game. He came on the podcast. We reached out to him before the 2022 whiteout when Penn State whooped Minnesota, and we heard from him then. We're going to do it once again to preview the latest matchup in this series. It's Ryan Burns from within our 24/7 Sports Network, longtime beat reporter on Minnesota and insider for the Golden Gophers. So, Ryan, as usual, we appreciate your perspective on this particular game week.
Yeah, appreciate you having me back. I'll say this. I'd much rather cover a game like 2019 where it's at least close than what I had to witness in that whiteout. But as I'm sure many of your listeners know, it tends to happen very often to whoever is that unfortunate opponent for the whiteout.
Let's jump into this particular installment of Penn State versus Minnesota. Not an annual matchup, but there have been some matchups in recent years between James Franklin and PJ Fleck. And when you look at this particular setting, I want to start with just Minnesota and where they are coming into the game. 6-4 on the season. They had a 4-game win streak mid-year, but saw that snapped last matchup when they visited Rutgers. They had a late bye week last Saturday. So with all that in mind, how is this 6-4 record through 10 matchups matching what you anticipated in the preseason? And where is this team right now? The coming off a late bye and coming off its first loss in a while.
Yeah, if you look at my preseason expectations for this team, I had them 6-4 going into this game. Now, I'll tell you, don't look at the games that I thought they were going to win versus the one they were going to lose. It's been a very bumpy ride. And that's where, if you look at national expectations coming into the season for this team, Minnesota, when the Big Ten win totals opened in Vegas back in the spring, had a 4.5 win total. That was tied for the lowest in the Big Ten with Purdue. Now, I think it ended up at 5 or 5.5. But the reality is this team could be 8-2. They also could be somewhere around 5-5, maybe even 4-6. They have been really advantageous or taking care of some one-score games where you look at the USC and the UCLA game. They get late touchdowns in those games to be able to put them away. But then you've also got games like the one that they had to start off their season against North Carolina, where they lose a game they probably had no really business losing. Now, it was offense, defense, and special teams playing their sloppiest performances of the Fleck era. Their kicker misses 2 kicks from within 45 yards, including one to win it at the end. But it's been a very interesting ride, I'll say that. You mentioned the 4-game winning streak in between, where you've got USC, UCLA, Maryland, and Minnesota just played well. And I think they played really consistently. I think the take-give was huge in those games where Minnesota hadn't turned over the football until late in the fourth quarter against Rutgers in nearly 18 quarters. And if you are a college football team and you're doing that, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to win games. And then on the flip side, Minnesota's got, I believe, 20 takeaways in the season. They are plus 12 in the take give, which is a big reason why they're 6-4. That's number 1 in the Big Ten, but it's certainly been a very roller coaster ride of sorts for every single one of these games.
You mentioned the season opener against North Carolina at home. It was a 2-point loss. The Tar Heels have had a rough season since then. They dropped their first 2 Big Ten matchups, home against Iowa 31-14 in September 21st. The next Saturday, they lost at Michigan by 3 points. Then comes the 4-game win streak, which you just laid out, tacked on by a road trip to Illinois. Then they lose at Rutgers 26-19. So does that loss to Rutgers, does that do anything to the momentum, maybe the energy around this program that you were sensing when they were piling up the wins? Because it comes at a tough time for them, because all of a sudden you're pushing pause on the season with a mid-November bye week. Mm-hmm. And, oh, by the way, you're going to host a top 5 program coming out of it.
Yeah, I would say that Fleck says he doesn't believe in momentum. I do. I mean, I think it's something, especially with 18 to 23-year-olds, they can sense it, they can feed on it. In that Rutgers game, they're leading in the fourth quarter, and they arguably play one of their worst offensive line quarters of the Fleck era, where they just implode. They had a stretch in that fourth quarter where they had 10 offensive plays, negative 10 yards, a turnover, and a safety. I mean, it went about as pear-shaped as humanly possible. And that game meant a lot more to them, even though they'll never say that, because PJ Fleck got his first Power 4 coaching job from Greg Schiano, who's the head coach there. Both of Rutgers' coordinators had been coordinators at Minnesota. They got raises to go to Rutgers. Their protégés are the coordinators at Minnesota. Ethan Kaliakmanis is now the quarterback at Rutgers, and he played well against the Golden Gophers. So that was one they certainly wanted. I think it left a bad taste in everybody's mouth heading into the bye week, but Minnesota was banged up. I think every college football coach ever has said the bye week never comes at a bad time. But that's where their star tailback, Darius Taylor, looked like a shell of himself in that game. Couldn't really make anybody miss. Their best pass rusher, Ja Joyner, had been playing through an ankle sprain. He gets an extra week to repair. And so I know from talking with Fleck on Monday that they spent a lot of the bye week trying to figure out if they can find a chink in the armor that has been a Penn State team that's playing very, very well, especially, I think, defensively. So they're going to do their best. I mean, you look at the spread for this game, I think it's around a 12-point spread. Is it quite what it was in 19 when I think it was a 6-point spread for that undefeated matchup? But if Minnesota plays well, I mean, they can certainly, as they've shown with any team on their schedule so far, I mean, they can play with anybody. But it's just consistency, especially up front, that has kind of been, you don't know what you're going to get from a specific game to a specific quarter to even specific drives. If they play well up front, this game is going to be a lot closer than I think Penn State fans want.
You mentioned that Minnesota's former starting quarterback is now Rutgers' starting quarterback. Thus, the Golden Gophers have a new trigger man on offense, and that's Max Brosmer. He was an FCS All-American at New Hampshire, and James Franklin was pretty complimentary of him during our Monday conference here in Happy Valley. He specifically said that he's done a really good job of protecting the football during their recent stretch, and that coincides with what you talked about with the turnover department for that nice run for Minnesota. So generally speaking, what does his body of work look like, and what does he bring into this Penn State matchup that fans on our end need to be aware of?
Yeah, Max Brosmer has not committed a turnover since September, and we're obviously 3 weeks into November now, which is a big part of why Minnesota's been as successful as they've been. He's completing about 67% of his passes, which if that holds here through the final couple of games, he'll smash Minnesota's all-time completion percentage record. He's now set the record for Fleck era pass attempts. I think it just says a lot about the stage of where this Minnesota offense is. Historically, they've been very much a run-first team, one that Penn State fans will remember when Minnesota took them down. It was a three-headed monster that day. Rodney Smith, Shannon Brooks, Mohamed Ibrahim. Darius Taylor's a very talented back, but I don't think he's quite Mo Ibrahim status, I would say. But Brosmer, the biggest thing with him is he knows how to take care of the football, and he knows how to make the smart decision with the football. There have been multiple times, too, where if it's a close game going into the fourth quarter, Brosmer plays his best football. I mean, he has led game-winning drive after game-winning drive. I think about the USC and the UCLA game specifically. He did it again against Illinois. Should have had one against North Carolina, but the kicker misses the kick. If it's close into the fourth quarter, that's where he really starts to shine, is he can find where it's supposed to go. He's a guy that consistently gets to his second, third, and even fourth reads at times. But it all, to me, also comes down to what is the play in front of him. And that's where if he can be protected, like any college football quarterback, he can be accurate with the football. He can be able to make throws. But if he's under pressure, he's going to get a little bit of happy feet at times. Then the passes become a little bit more errant. So that's where it's going to be, as much as it is Max Brosmer against this Penn State defense, who I think all three level-wise is the best defense that Minnesota has played all year. I think Michigan's defensive tackles are obviously very talented players, going to be first-rounders, but all three levels, for my money, from what I've seen, I think Penn State's defense is the best. And if Brosmer is going to have to be able to throw into tight windows, which I expect him to have to do, he better be protected up front, or else this Penn State rush is going to be able to give him problems.
The way you described Brosmer and looking at his year so far, 67% completion, 2,200 yards, 14 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, as you said, avoiding mistakes in September, it seems. Is it fair to say, and tell me if I'm wrong, that Minnesota is as confident in their quarterback position right now as it has been since maybe 2019 when Tanner Morgan was rolling and Kirk Ciarrocca was the OC there? And obviously we saw how sharp they were against Penn State that particular November.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say, especially in that 2019 season with Ciarrocca and Morgan, that RPO was really humming then. And I mean, Ciarrocca had a heck of a game plan for that Penn State game, so much so where, as you know, James Franklin said, if I can't beat him, I'm going to hire him. Now, it didn't go the way I think many people thought it was going to go. But what they asked Brosmer to do, I think, is a lot different from that 2019. This is not an RPO offense anymore. It's very much one that's NFL type of style. But I think the thing for them is going to be, they ask him to do a lot. They ask him to make protection calls at the line. He's got the opportunity to, have choice plays where if he doesn't like it, he can kill it to a different play. That's something we really haven't seen a Minnesota quarterback do. Now, Greg Harbaugh, the offensive coordinator, has a lot of confidence in him. Brosmer is very, very experienced in being able to do so. So I would say that I think PJ is as confident in his quarterback as he's been certainly since that 19 season.
So that's certainly a positive step for Minnesota going into this matchup. But then I look at what they've failed to accomplish on the ground so far. 17th out of 18 in Big Ten, among Big Ten competition in rushing offense. Is this related to the running back room? You mentioned an injury at the top of it. Is this an offensive line issue? And then generally speaking, what's your outlook going against the Nittany Lions, who really have shut a lot of teams down on the ground? And if they're able to do that and make this a one-dimensional contest, what then does that create for Brosmer?
Yeah, the story of the season has been what is going on with the offensive line to me, because they have a first-round draft pick at left tackle in Ariante Ursary. So I just accepted his Senior Bowl invite the other day. They've got a 3-year starter at right tackle who's now at right guard. They've got a multi-year starter at left guard, a center who started games last year, and they've got another position, whether it's right guard or right tackle, that has been kind of a revolving door of different guys. But they shouldn't be as inconsistent as they've been. And I don't understand why it has necessarily been that way, because they are old, they are talented, but the game to game, you don't know what you're going to get. Like, I think about the last 2 games specifically for Minnesota. They go into Champaign against an Illini defense that I think is pretty decent. And they're able to run the football for 60 minutes. They're able to protect Brosmer. And then the next week against Rutgers is getting home with 4 consistently. Minnesota has no run game to speak of. They're getting knocked back into the backfield. Their backs have nowhere to go. I don't understand why it is the way that it is, but at some point, which I think we're certainly at that point, 10 games into the season, you are who you are. And so historic trends would tell me Minnesota plays really well on the offensive line one game, say Illinois, then the next week against Rutgers, they don't. Well, they got a bye week to prepare. They're going to get healthier. They're going to get their starting left guard back in Tyler Cooper, who is in the concussion protocol, missed the last couple of games. In theory, this should be a game where they play better, especially at home on senior day. It's going to be the coldest game of the year for both teams. It should be at about 35 degrees for a high in Minneapolis Saturday afternoon. But that's the story, is if the offensive line comes to play in this one, which they have the bodies and the talent to do, I think they're going to be able to find some success. Now, if they're not able to, I'm going to have nightmares about Max Brosmer being under duress for the final 50 minutes of the game. I expect Minnesota to try to come out and establish the run a little bit, but to your point, it's been a lot easier said than done against that Nittany Lion defense all season long.
Across the field, seems like pretty middle of the pack in terms of Big Ten rankings for this rush defense for Minnesota, more like top third of the conference in terms of pass defense to this point. What are the strengths and weaknesses for that unit for these 10 games so far?
Yeah, they are one of the most opportunistic defenses in college football. They are one of the most, I think they have, like I said, I think around 20 turnovers so far this season. They have been the place you don't want to be against Minnesota's defense is in second and third and long, because that's when the defensive coordinator, Corey Heatherman, can mix up his passing down packages. You're going to see 6 guys shown at the line of scrimmage. They rush only 4 or 5 with twists and stunts. You've got some defensive backs like Justin Wally, Coy Parrish, the true freshman, of which I heard James Franklin talk up the other day. I mean, they have just been, if they can get you thinking one thing or showing one thing pre-snap, and then they give you something different post-snap, that's where the opposing quarterbacks have been making some poor decisions with the football, and Minnesota's secondary has been very opportunistic around it. Now, I would note the one thing I'm a little bit leery about, which is why Penn State's number 4 in the country and Minnesota's 6-4, is Penn State has been elite on third down. I mean, they are the number 1 team in the Big Ten on third down. Minnesota is a bottom 5 team in the country on third down. And within that, Penn State's ability to consistently be in third and short, Minnesota has been awful in third and short situations. So if I'm Minnesota, I want to make Drew Aller and Andy Kotelicki go 12 plays and make you beat them that way. But Minnesota's run defense has been suspect at sometimes they've been better. But I'll tell you, it starts up front. Minnesota only rotates essentially 5 guys on their defensive line. So they were worn down in that Rutgers game, but with a bye week to prepare, you'd like to hope that they got their legs underneath them a little bit more.
You referenced that James Franklin gave a shout out to Coy Parrish. I mean, where is he in terms of instant impact, big time pickups in this era for PJ Fleck? Because he was a top 100 guy from the state of Minnesota, bunch of power conference opportunities to leave his home, instead signs with the Golden Gophers, and now working through his freshman year, he leads the Big Ten in interception. So how much of a revelation has this been for the program with Parrish, and who are the other playmakers on defense who have that ability to swing momentum?
Yeah, Parrish's story is one that doesn't historically happen here, where I think he's the second highest rated recruit to sign with Minnesota in the internet era. In-state kid from Esco, Minnesota, which if you don't know where that is, I don't blame you. I'd never really heard of Esco, and I'm someone who lives here and has my entire life. It's about 2 hours north of the Twin Cities, just south of Duluth. And to give you an indication of how sought after Coy Parrish was, Ryan Day, the last possible day that he could, it was the Friday before National Signing Day, took a private plane from Columbus to Duluth, Minnesota to go see Coy Parrish to try and get him to sign with the Buckeyes. He ends up sticking with Minnesota. He's just a very, very gifted player. Someone that is 6'1", 205 pounds, has really, really good instincts, knows how to really read quarterbacks in terms of being in the right spot at the right time. And then he makes plays on the football. He's also Minnesota's return man. So I thought that there was going to be a really good chance for him to make an impact, but leading the Big Ten in interceptions with a couple of games to go certainly wasn't on my menu. I didn't have that really on the play call sheet. So he has been a revelation. He's been arguably their best return man in the Fleck era too. Someone that's very fearless, especially in the punt return game. But you've also got Justin Wally on the outside there, who is a 4-year starter at corner. He's been playing some of his best football. Cody Lindenberg, number 45 at linebacker, has been very consistent for the last month. He's the healthiest that he's been. And then on the defensive line, Ja Joyner is their best pass rusher, someone that had been playing through an ankle injury the last couple of weeks, hadn't been 100%, but he ends the Illinois game. It's the only snap he played on Illinois' final offensive drive. He turns the corner on the right tackle, is able to get a forced fumble. He is very impactful when he's healthy. He's got a bye week to get that ankle ready. So it's going to be, like I said, that defense needed to get their legs underneath them. And the hope would be with a bye week to prepare, they're going to have that chance.
Peretz just particularly comes across as a primetime player. I know he had that game-sealing interception against USC, which
Yep.
A lot of people were focused in on that game, and just seems like he's a guy who could sense whether he's a return man, back deep. Could be some opportunities to build that brand further in a matchup like this. I'm curious to see him play against Penn State on Saturday. Two dynamics I don't want to overlook before we get to prediction time with you. One is special teams. What do we need to know about that unit from Minnesota? And then the other is you've scattered the conversation with a few of these notes on injuries. Are there any others that we need to be aware of? And are there any that you're particularly going to be focused on with the binoculars from the press box during pregame on Saturday?
Yeah, I'll start with injuries. Fleck refuses to talk about injuries. It's one of the things, as media members, we have to ask about. Fans want to know. We want to know. The response it's been for now 3 or 4 years since the availability report or whenever it's been is you'll find out 2 hours ahead of time and he'll hit you with a smirk on his face with it. But like I said, Darius Taylor, their star running back who leads all Big Ten running backs in receptions, he was dinged up going into that Rutgers game, didn't really play one of his best games. He's expected to play in theory. He should be as healthy as he's been. They're going to get their starting left guard back, Tyler Cooper, one of their better offensive linemen there. Ja Joyner, the best pass rusher, had been playing through an ankle injury. The hope would be that he's as healthy as he's been. So relatively speaking, they should be pretty healthy. Now, I smirked earlier when you asked me about special teams. They're not very good. I'll be straight with you, is the first half of the season before the bye week, their kicker, Dragan Kesich, 7 of 13 after being the Big Ten kicker of the year last year. Now, since the bye week, I believe he's 8 of 8 on field goal attempts, so he's found it. But their punt game is not very strong, especially in attempting to flip the field. It's going to be 36 yards in a cloud of dust. They haven't had a return touchdown since 2018. They're really no threat to block anything. It has not been very good for special teams wise, but I tell you, if they can get Kesich to make field goals, that's going to be very big for them, because I'm assuming this is going to be, if Minnesota is able to topple Penn State, a lower scoring game. But special teams for Minnesota, not exactly a strength, and not exactly knowing what you're going to get from game to game with that unit.
I guess just feeling a lot better about the place kicker now that he's ripped off some positivity versus
Right.
when he's at a 50% rate early in the season. Wouldn't want to carry that into this matchup. Let's talk about your forecast. I know it's relatively early in the week. We're recording on a Tuesday afternoon. We both still have more to learn about our respective teams that we cover leading up to kickoff. But in your mind, Minnesota will put itself in a position to pull off the upset on Saturday and ultimately, how do you see this one playing out? If you're good to give us a score, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, if Minnesota is going to be able to pull off the upset, I would say they are going to have to make Penn State's offense and Andy Kotelicki go 10, 12, 14 plays. If there's explosive plays all over the field, if Tyler Warren gets loose, if one of these running backs gets loose, it's not going to go well for them. They're also going to have to figure out a way to turn over a quarterback that is number 1 in the Big Ten and the least amount of turnover-worthy plays, according to Pro Football Focus. They've got to be able to force multiple turnovers. They've got to be able to make Penn State drive 10, 12 plays down the field and try to hold them for field goals. And then on the flip side, Minnesota's offense, I think, has the much more difficult test. Like I said, I have the utmost respect for Penn State's defense. I think it's the best defense that Minnesota has faced all season. And it comes down to the offensive line. I like to affectionately call them the Minnesota Moving Company. If the Minnesota Moving Company can protect Max Brosmer and they can establish the resemblance of a running game, I'm not saying establish it in 5, 6, 7 yards a carry. If they can just be 2nd and 7 and 3rd and 4, that's a good place to be, because I want nothing to do with 2nd and 3rd and long and allow some of these pass rushers for Penn State to be able to pin their ears back. I want nothing to do with Abdul Carter. I'll tell you that right now. Or even Dennis Sutton. I want nothing to do with that. So if Minnesota is going to be able to do that, they got to hit explosive plays. Like I think back to that 2019 game, Rashad Bateman, Tyler Johnson, Chris Ottman-Bell, they were explosive plays all over the field. But you can't try to get into a track meet with this team. It's got to be low possessions. It's got to be a 21-17 type of game, because Penn State's defense isn't going to give up much more than that. So if Minnesota wins, that's what it's going to be. Now, I tell you, I think the most likely scenario, it's senior day. Minnesota hasn't been at home in a while. It's an opportunity on national television. I think ultimately I don't have enough faith in Minnesota's lines to be able to tell you that they can get this done. If you ask me today, I think it's probably somewhere around 27-14, 27-17 Penn State at this point. But if Minnesota's lines come to play and they get to the fourth quarter, I'll remind you, Max Brosmer has been really good in the fourth quarter. Whether it's Illinois, UCLA, USC, if they can just protect him, good things can happen. But I'm going to need to see a lot from Minnesota's offensive and defensive lines in this game to make me think that they can put themselves in a position in the fourth quarter to potentially upset the number 4 team in the country.
Nobody covers Minnesota football as detailed and consistently as Ryan Burns does within our 24/7 sports network at gopherillustrated.com. We appreciate it. I'll be following your coverage to make sure I know what's going on from the other end of this matchup through kickoff, and then we'll see what happens Saturday afternoon into early evening in a very cold Minnesota setting. I don't know if it's so cold for you, but just picturing that, sub 30 degrees by the end of this game. We've reached a different phase of the calendar year. We've already crossed off the trip out to Los Angeles as new Big Ten Tory. This feels a little bit more at home. Minneapolis, cold weather, late November. This is more like Big Ten football. So, Ryan, appreciate the perspective. Good luck with your week of coverage. Thanks for hopping on the podcast.
I appreciate you. And as a true Minnesotan, I'll tell you, it's not the cold that'll get you. It's the wind. And luckily for this game, the wind isn't supposed to be that bad. But 35 degrees is 35 degrees. Excited to cover yet another Big Ten game in late November.
All right, we'll catch up with you soon. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Great stuff from Ryan. We will jump on board with our next podcast on Thursday. You can always expect that one to drop during game weeks. Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen will join me again, and we'll tell you what we heard and witnessed from the Penn State practice field. We'll get our latest look at the Nittany Lions on Wednesday, so you don't want to miss our takeaways from our trip to practice. Also, what we heard from James Franklin and a variety of players after that session. Big thanks to Tyler Cavaruso for hopping on earlier and breaking down the latest in Penn State recruiting. Plenty of his coverage to come over at Lions247.com, where we've got you covered for all the pregame action ahead of this Minnesota matchup on Saturday. With one more episode to come this week. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.